snow flurried like stray threads torn from heaven, drifting in uncertain spirals across the worn wood of the train platform. Evelina Rosewood stood still amid the cold, her gloved hands trembling around a letter that had grown limp with rereading. Her salt and pepper hair peeked out beneath a bonnet stiff with frost, the curls stiffened like silver lace. The letter, creased, tear-smudged, fragile, was signed by a man named Harold Dobbs of Dry Creek, who had promised a hearth and a second chance. But the train had come and gone. No one had met her name with a smile. No one had offered to carry her case. The station emptied with laughter and boots on boards. A young bride with sunlit curls was hoisted by her grinning groom. Two boys tussled near a coal bin. An old man tipped his hat to his daughter returning from a city. Evelina had seen it all, standing as still as the cast-iron pole holding the lantern aloft. She had not moved, not even when the final whistle screamed and the last of the baggage carts rolled away. They had all come for someone, but no one had come for her. She moved at last when her knees grew untrustworthy, stepping toward the low bench near the edge of the platform, just out of reach of the depot's sputtering stove glow. Her boots, once sturdy, had grown stiff with snowmelt, and each step echoed with shame louder than any train horn. "You all right, ma'am?" a voice asked, sweet and shy. A young woman, barely 19, with hands red from lifting crates. Her apron was too thin for the weather, but her eyes held concern. Evelina forced a polite smile. "Yes, dear. Just waiting." "For someone coming later?" She nodded vaguely, but the girl lingered, glancing at the letter in Evelina's lap. Her gaze softened, understanding blooming too quickly. "You need a place to sit warm. I can ask my pa. He works the post over there. Ain't much, but there's coffee." "No," Evelina said too sharply. Then softening, "Thank you, but I'm quite all right." The girl hesitated, then left her a small tin cup anyway. "Just in case," she whispered. "You got such a kind face." Evelina stared at the steam curling from the cider like a spirit. She hadn't been called kind in a long time. The cold was crawling into her bones now beneath the corset around her spine, between the years she couldn't take back. She turned the letter in her lap, mouthing the words again. "Your eyes sound gentle," it had said. "I need gentleness more than anything else." And yet, gentleness had not been enough to bring Harold Dobbs. Across the way, a man in a long black coat turned and whispered something to a woman beside him. Evelina didn't need to hear the words. She had heard versions of them for years. A woman her age, still chasing marriage? What fool thinks gray hair can catch a husband? Her fingers twitched. She tucked the letter away, folded it like a wound, and slid it into her satchel. She could feel their stares clinging like frost to her skirts. At 55, she had become an oddity, a woman in her final bloom trying to sell a dream that time had supposedly stolen. Once, she had been vibrant. A music teacher in Missouri, a midwife in the mining towns, a wife for 17 years until Jacob passed beneath a harsh February sky. She had not sought love again until her hands had begun to ache from solitude. She looked up at the iron train sign above, reading it again, Dry Creek. The name now felt cruel, dry and empty. A wagon rolled past on the far road, wheels crunching over frozen gravel. Evelina turned slightly, hoping it might be Harold at last, late, confused, apologetic. But it was a family of settlers with 3 children clambering over sacks of grain. The father barely glanced toward the station. Her hands tightened around the cup. The cider had gone cold. Wind tugged at her shawl, making the old pins groan in her hair. She had packed 3 dresses, a hand-knit quilt, a jar of peach preserves, and her mother's Bible. All her hopes, folded into a single carpet bag, now sitting beneath her boots like an obedient dog. Her whole life, shrunk down to a waiting game that had expired hours ago. A low voice passed behind her. "Mail order bride, I reckon." Past her prime. Shame, really. She didn't turn, didn't give them the courtesy of her tears. But shame had already seeped under her skin like snow melt through cotton. A bell chimed as the depot door opened again. Evelina didn't look this time. Not until a pair of footsteps paused, not rushed like the others, but slow, deliberate. She glanced over her shoulder. A man stood watching her, not leering or judging, just observing. He was tall, taller than any man she'd seen in years, broad-shouldered with a pale hat hanging from his hand. His coat was dusted with flurries, long blonde hair damp with snow. His eyes were shadowed under his brow unreadable, but they didn't flick away when she met them. She expected him to turn. He didn't. Instead, he lifted a wrapped cloth parcel from his coat pocket and walked past her. Not toward her, past her. But before he reached the far fence, he placed a bundle on the bench beside her, without a word. Then he kept walking, boots crunching slow and steady until he disappeared down the lane. Evelina blinked. Her hands hovered, reluctant. She unwrapped it. Inside was cornbread still warm, and 3 slices of dried apple. A small note was tucked between the folds. It said, "You ain't invisible." The words buckled something in her. She pressed her lips shut to keep from sobbing aloud. How long had it been since someone had seen her? Not with pity, but truly seen? The storm thickened around her as lamps flickered on a crosstown. Snow began to fall harder, painting the world white and hushed. She pulled the food close, wrapping it back up carefully. Her fingers paused on the note, the paper crinkling under her touch. The cider was cold, but she drank it anyway. One of the train station lamps buzzed above, casting a flickering glow onto the boards at her feet. Somewhere behind her, the young station girl returned to sweep ash from the stove. Children laughed in the saloon a street over. Church bells rang 6. Evelina stood. The bench had grown cold, her skirt stiff with weather. But something small inside her had warmed. She picked up her suitcase. Not toward the boarding house. Not back to the depot. She followed the path the stranger had taken. The wind howled across the prairie as night fell deep and wide, but she walked into it with her head high, the note crumpled in her palm like a promise. Somewhere in Dry Creek, a door would open. Or it would not. But the world had blinked just once and seen her. And she had blinked back. She didn't see the man watching from the ridge behind the livery stable, arms folded, breath steaming into the dusk. He didn't follow her, not yet. But his boots shifted slightly in the snow, as if marking her step with his own. The stars broke through the clouds as she disappeared around the bend. And behind her, the station girl whispered to no one in particular. He left her food. Maybe she ain't leaving after all. Because sometimes, the loneliest stories begin not with rescue, but with the soft weight of cornbread on a bench. The snowfall had thickened, softening the town into quiet outlines of wood and smoke. Evelina walked with slow, stubborn grace down the muddy road that led away from the station, her carpetbag tugging at her wrist like the weight of old choices. The stranger's note rested inside her pocket, its edges growing worn from the rub of her thumb. "You ain't invisible." Words that had wedged themselves into the hollow between her ribs. No direction, no name, just a stranger's food and a stranger's eyes that hadn't darted away in discomfort. She didn't know if she was walking toward hope or humiliation, but her feet kept moving, guided by instinct and the fragile momentum of kindness. At the edge of town, a wide road broke into open land. Beyond the fence lines stood a livery stable, a mercantile closed for the evening, and beyond that, the shape of a barn half swallowed by trees. She paused at a fork, wind clutching her shawl, unsure. The snow muffled everything now, yet she felt watched, not with suspicion, but with quiet curiosity. A crow cawed overhead. She followed it with her eyes and spotted him again, half-shadowed beneath a lean-to roof beside the barn, brushing snow from a saddle. He didn't startle when she turned. He didn't speak. Evelina gathered herself and stepped off the road, lifting her skirts delicately through the slush. Her heart beat high in her throat. Her voice was careful, but it did not tremble. "Sir, I believe you left something behind at the station." He didn't answer at once. The snow fell between them like a curtain of down. Then he straightened slowly, eyes the color of river stones flicking from her face to the bag in her hand. A pause. "I don't believe I did." Her fingers curled around the paper-wrapped bundle she'd carried back, still warm when she left, now cool and fragrant. Cornbread. Apples. A note. He stepped forward, not in threat, but in recognition. "Figured you'd throw it out." "I nearly did." She looked down. "But I didn't." A small nod. as if that said more than any conversation could. He walked past her and opened the barn's side door, revealing a lantern-lit space with hay stacked in corners and tools lined in perfect rows. "You got a name?" he asked, voice low and gravel-thick. She looked up. "Evelina. Evelina Rosewood." He took that in with a measured blink. "McAllister. Folks call me Sebastian." No handshake. No smile. Just names offered like tools placed side by side. She waited. He looked over her worn coat, the frayed edges of her sleeves, the tight clench of her jaw. "You got somewhere to sleep tonight?" It was the first time someone had asked her that in months. Not out of politeness, but care. "No," she said softly. He motioned with his chin. "Cabin's up yonder. Yellow pine door. It's unlocked. Fire's lit." Evelina hesitated, clutching her bag closer. "I don't take charity." "You ain't. I got stew that won't keep, and a stove that burns too hot for one man. If it makes it easier, consider it a trade. You eat supper, I don't waste food." It was his way of giving her permission to exist in his space without debt. That mattered. She followed the worn trail up a small slope. The cabin came into view beneath a copse of twisted juniper trees, windows glowing amber through frost-lace glass. The door opened without creak. Inside, the air wrapped her in heat and cedar. A table with 2 chairs. A stone hearth. A wash basin still steaming. Everything plain, clean, touched by a quiet kind of care. She took off her gloves with shaking fingers, as if afraid they might disintegrate with warmth. Then she lowered herself into the chair nearest the fire, the bag kept close at her feet. Later, he entered without fanfare, a bundle of wood under one arm and the scent of leather and snow trailing behind. He didn't comment on her being there. Didn't speak as he fed the fire or fetched 2 bowls from the shelf. Only when he placed the stew before her, thick with beans, venison, and turnip, did he pause. "You can stay one night. Tomorrow's your choice." "Thank you," she whispered. They ate in silence, the ticking of the mantel clock and the occasional crackle of sap their only company. When the bowl was clean, she set down her spoon and lifted her gaze to him. "I was supposed to be married today," she said, quiet but steady. He didn't react. Just watched her with those still, unreadable eyes. He never came. Said I was kind. Said he needed kindness. A bitter laugh slipped through. Maybe I was too kind. Or too old. Or maybe both. Sebastian stood and walked to a shelf near the door, pulled down a worn wool blanket and handed it to her. "Kindness ain't ever the problem," he said. Her throat closed around that. She clutched the blanket like a lifeline, but didn't unfold it. "Why'd you help me?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he crossed the window and looked out at the darkening snow. His voice came low, like something he didn't usually share. "My grandmother raised me. Folks ignored her after my granddad died. She used to say people turn invisible when they stop being useful." He paused. "You reminded me of her. In your eyes." Evelina let the word settle. Not pity. Recognition. "Thank you," she said again. This time with her whole voice. He nodded once, then disappeared down the hallway. The bed was small but soft, and the firelight danced against the log walls like memories on skin. Evelina curled under the quilt with the blanket tucked over her feet, listening to the wind whistle outside. Her hands, so used to absence, ached from being held in warmth. She didn't sleep for hours. But when she did, she dreamed of music, of playing again in front of laughing children, her fingers light, her heart fuller than it had felt in years. In the morning, the smell of frying eggs woke her. She sat up, dazed, and walked barefoot to the stove, blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. Sebastian stood there in a soft undershirt, his hair loose and damp. He handed her a plate. "I've got chores," he said. "You're welcome to stay the day." She nodded, wordless, sat down to eat. Later, she stood at the doorway and watched him hitch a yoke to a stubborn mule, snow still thick on the ground. He worked with calm efficiency, like a man who had done everything himself for far too long. She moved to the sink, washed the dishes without being asked. She swept the floor. She mended the tear in one of his gloves with thread from her satchel. She didn't ask to stay. He didn't ask her to leave. That night, she made cornbread from his pantry and laid it on the table without explanation. When he bit into it, his eyes crinkled slightly. Approval, not surprise. They did not touch. They did not talk about feelings. But when she looked over her shoulder from the stove and saw him place a second chair beside his own before the fire, she knew what it meant. No grand declarations. No proposal. Just space made. Room offered. A place set for someone once invisible. When the fire crackled low and they both sat with mugs in hand, Evelina turned to him. What do folks think of a man living with a woman who was left at the altar? Sebastian didn't answer. Just looked at her long and slow. Then he stood, walked to the mantel, and reached behind the clock. He pulled out a folded paper, laid it on the table in front of her. It was a wanted ad. A man named Harold Dobbs. Arrested 2 towns over for fraud. Mail-order bride scheme. Several victims. Last seen boarding westbound train with another woman, 25, blonde. Evelina's breath left her like smoke from a snuff candle. Sebastian's voice was low. I went into town this morning. Thought you should know. Her hands gripped the edge of the table. So I was never meant to be picked up at all. No, he said. You weren't. A long silence settled, snow brushing the windows. Then he added, so softly it nearly disappeared. But maybe you were meant to end up here. She looked at him then, truly looked, and something inside her, fragile and bruised, began to knit itself whole again. Outside, the wind quieted, and Evelina Rosewood, once left to the cold, leaned back in her chair and whispered, then maybe I'll stay a while longer. Sebastian had risen before dawn, of course. She heard him every morning, boots on floorboards, water scooped, door creaking. He never said where he went, only returned with hay tangled in his sleeves, snow on his collar, and his silence intact. The cabin was beginning to feel less borrowed. Evelina had folded her quilt over the rocker, lined her hairpins neatly in the washstand drawer, and placed her spectacles by the window, where the light came in strongest mid-morning. She never asked to stay, but she had begun planting herself into the edges of the place, like ivy testing brick, tender and unsure. That morning, she fixed him a breakfast he didn't ask for. Cornmeal cakes, fried in lard, and thick-cut bacon with the rind still curling. He didn't say thank you, but he took his time eating it, set his fork down gently afterward, and lingered. That was his way of saying he noticed. Afterward, Evelina stood by the window, mug in hand, watching him work the fence line. Every movement Sebastian made was quiet, almost reverent, as though he was in conversation with the land. His hands moved slow and exact, sleeves rolled up, exposing forearms knotted with use. She admired not just the strength, but the restraint, the discipline of a man who had known hunger and never wanted it to show on another's face. Her heart had not fluttered in years, but something near it stirred. It wasn't girlish. It wasn't romantic, not in the way young folk mean it. It was steadier, a sense of being seen, of being useful again. She washed dishes with sleeves rolled, and the window cracked open to let in the cold. And then she saw it, the scar on Sebastian's back. His coat had slipped as he lifted a coil of wire, and beneath his undershirt, a jagged wound, old and cruel, ran from shoulder to hip. It looked like it had never healed properly. A whip? A tool? She couldn't tell. But it wasn't the wound that caught her breath, it was the way he moved through it, as if pain had become part of how he understood the world. That evening, while the stew simmered, Evelina brought it up, not directly, but close enough. Do you believe the past makes a home in us, even when we change houses? She asked. He didn't look at her, just kept stirring. Some pasts are squatter kinds, he said. Don't leave, even when you ask polite. They sat in silence long after the fire died down to ember. No more questions. But she noticed he pulled his coat tighter the next morning, as if she'd seen too much. Evelina gave him space, cleaned the pantry shelves, organized the tool bench by size and wear. She stitched patches on a few of his flannel shirts, nothing flashy, just thread matched to fabric, her seams as hidden as the life she once lived. One afternoon, she swept the porch while he mended a wagon wheel beneath a lean-to. The wind had softened and birds returned, pecking in the brown brush. She hummed a tune she hadn't sung since Missouri, a waltz children used to dance to in her parlor. A memory stirred like cream in coffee. He stopped working, didn't speak, just listened. When she caught him watching, he didn't turn away. That night, he brought her an old fiddle case. "Found this in the loft," he said. "Figured you might know what to do with it." She opened it slowly, reverently. The strings were rusted, the bow frayed, but the wood had held its shape. She pressed her fingers to its curve like greeting an old friend returned from war. She tuned it as best she could, fingers shaky. When she played, the notes were broken, uneven, but true. Sebastian sat by the fire without a word, and Evelina played until her eyes brimmed. Later, she tucked the fiddle under the bed. Not because she was finished, but because she wasn't ready to let go again. The snow began to melt. Ruts formed along the road, deep and soft, reminding the town that mud came next. Evelina walked to town with Sebastian once, carrying a jar of pickled carrots to barter. Folks stared. Some nodded. A few whispered. One woman muttered to another near the general store, "He could have had a preacher's daughter." Evelina heard. So did Sebastian. But he only stepped closer to her side and said nothing. She didn't need defense. She needed dignity. And he gave her that, wordless and full. That night, she found her boots on a small rug by the hearth, dried and brushed clean. The same rug he had never used before. She understood then. This place wasn't his prison. It was his sanctuary. And he had invited her in not with words, but with cleared space. Days passed like this. Quiet gestures. Shared bread. The smell of cedar smoke and wet leather. And a closeness that didn't need naming. But one morning, everything changed. Evelina was gathering eggs behind the cabin when she heard hoofbeats on the road. Too fast, too sharp. She turned. A rider, cloaked and urgent, reined in hard at the gate. Dust and snow sprayed up from hooves. Sebastian stepped from the barn, wiping his hands on his coat. The rider called out, "There's trouble down at Mill Creek. Flooded. Folks stuck." Sebastian didn't hesitate. "How many?" 3 kids and an old man. "They say the bridge collapsed." He nodded once, then looked at Evelina. Just looked. "I'll be back by sundown." She nodded, heart in her throat. He mounted and galloped off without another word, wind curling through his coat like wings. She stood alone on the porch, eggs forgotten in her basket. All day she watched the horizon, eyes stinging from wind and worry. She boiled cloth, readied salves. Her hands shook more than they used to, but she knew how to mend broken things. When the sun dipped low and Sebastian hadn't returned, she walked down to the gate. The road was still and silent. The second chair on the porch caught her eye. She walked up and sat in it for the first time. The cushion was stitched with blue thread, her favorite color. He had made it for her. She touched the armrest gently, like blessing a relic, and waited. Because now this was a place no one knew. A place where scars were not hidden, but held. Where age was not shame, but story. Where silence was not absence, but peace. And where, at last, she had someone to wait for. Far down the road, a figure appeared. Horse limping, rider hunched, but upright. Her breath caught. He was coming home. But behind him, riding double, was a small girl clutching his coat. And Evelina understood, in one slow blink, that something had changed. He hadn't just brought back a child. He had brought back a question. And it was hers to answer. The girl's name was Lark. 7 years old, light as kindling, with a mop of copper curls and eyes like river glass. She clung to Sebastian's coat for the first mile back, silent as the wind, then cried herself asleep before the hearth, wrapped in one of Evelina's shawls. Sebastian hadn't spoken much on the way in, just handed the child down with those strong, deliberate hands and said, "Her folks didn't make it. I couldn't leave her." Evelina hadn't argued. She'd held the girl like she'd held motherless infants in mining towns and train stations, her own breath slowing to calm the child's. She didn't ask what happened to the rest of them. The look in Sebastian's eyes said enough. Water had taken more than land that day. Now, 2 days later, the cabin held a third breath. Lark was small, but her grief filled the spaces like steam from a kettle, soft, constant. impossible to ignore. She didn't speak. Didn't cry anymore either. Just watched, all pupils, as if waiting for something to be taken again. Sebastian tried, in his quiet way. Left a carved pony beside her bed. Mended the broken doll she carried. Sewing the arm back on with stitches rough but sincere. But the child only blinked and clutched the doll tighter. It was Evelina who drew her in. She hummed while cooking, let Lark stir flour into cornbread batter. Showed her how to wipe the table in circles and not miss corners. Never once asked the girl to smile. By the end of a third day, Lark had started sleeping through the night. Her tiny socks, once draped near the fire, now appeared on a line Evelina had strung just for her. The child folded her own blanket, helped gather eggs, shadowed Evelina like a second hemline. But the shift, the real shift, came on the 7th morning. The porch boards creaked beneath small feet. Sebastian stepped out with his coffee and found Evelina braiding Lark's hair. The girl sat between her knees, back straight, face lifted to the light like a sunflower daring to bloom again. He didn't speak. Evelina glanced up at him, figured she'd feel stronger with her hair out of her eyes. He nodded once, then turned to look at the land, mug steaming in his hand. That night, Lark asked to sleep in the crook of Evelina's arm. And Sebastian watched them both for a long while from the doorframe, hands clenched in his pockets, as if holding something too fragile to name. But it was the town that couldn't keep its silence. They came knocking one fog-laced morning. Pastor Webb first, hat in hand, stiff as a dry willow. 3 souls in one cabin, he said, glancing between Sebastian and Evelina. Folks are beginning to wonder. Evelina stood in the doorway, back straight. Wonder what, exactly? Webb cleared his throat. It's not proper. A child in your care, no papers, and no wedding band between you. This town ain't lawless, nor without eyes. Sebastian said nothing, just stood beside her, arms crossed, face carved in stone. Evelina folded her arms. Then let the town write me a name for what they think I am. I already know who I am. The pastor looked as if she'd slapped him. You misunderstand my concern. No, she cut in. I've been misunderstood before. This is something else. He glanced at Sebastian. And you. Sebastian's jaw shifted. That girl was drowning in cold water. Nobody asked what I planned then. And now. She eats warm and sleeps safe. That's all I plan. Webb pursed his lips. Plans change. This ain't the kind of story towns forget. He left them with frost in his footsteps. That night, Evelina sat on the porch long after Lark had fallen asleep. The stars were sharp and thin, like glass pins stuck into velvet. Sebastian came out after a while, dragging the second chair closer. She didn't look at him. Do you regret it? No. I don't either, she said. But I'm tired of being watched like a scandal waiting to happen. Sebastian sipped from his mug. Let Em look. We know. There was a beat of silence before she asked, Know what? That we're better with her here. Evelina smiled faintly. That we are. She paused, then added, When I was younger, I thought love would come loudly, like a summer storm. But now. He turned slightly toward her, just enough for moonlight to touch the soft lines near his eyes. Now I think love is what stays after everything else leaves. He didn't respond with words, just reached down slowly and laid his hand atop hers on the armrest. Rough fingers warm. Neither moved for a long time. In the days that followed, the town didn't stop whispering. Evelina heard it at the market, saw it in the way shoulders turned, the way lips thinned as she walked past with Lark's small hand in hers. Some muttered about decency. Others hinted about inheritance or motive. But some eyes softened too. Calla, the station girl, brought over a dress for Lark. Pale blue. Hand-stitched buttons. An older woman slipped Evelina a jar of jam with no words exchanged. And Sebastian, he kept showing up in smaller ways. Left chopped would stack twice as high. Took to brewing tea just the way she liked. Carried her sewing basket in from the porch when the wind picked up. Still, he never asked her to stay, and she never asked him to want her. One afternoon, As she dusted the shelves, Evelina found a small wooden carving on the windowsill. It was of 3 figures, one tall, one slightly shorter, and a tiny one between them. Their hands weren't linked, but they leaned toward each other as if caught mid-step. She knew then he'd carved it by firelight. That night, she brought it to the table, held it gently. "You made this," she said. He nodded once. "It's not finished." "I know." Their eyes met over the firelight. "Are we?" she asked softly. His reply came quiet and sure. "Not yet." Later, she stood outside, stars wheeling above like stories too far to reach. The cold had settled deep again, but she felt warm. Lark's laughter echoed from within the cabin. Sebastian was oiling the door hinges. The world had narrowed to something small and sacred. And that's when the rider came. Dusk lit the trail gold and bloody behind him. His horse kicked mud and slush. His voice cracked the quiet like a whip. "I'm looking for Evelina Rosewood." She stepped forward, hands curling in her apron. He halted, face streaked with sweat and dust. "Got a message for you, ma'am. Urgent." Sebastian stepped beside her, posture straightening. The rider dismounted, reached into his saddlebag, and handed her an envelope. The seal was broken. The paper smelled of tobacco and old regret. She opened it. Read it once. Then again. And slowly, her face drained of color. When she finally spoke, her voice was a whisper. "He's not dead." Sebastian's brow furrowed. "Who?" Evelina looked up at him, hands trembling. "Jacob. Her late husband. The one buried 17 years ago." Or so she thought. The world felt thin, like glass stretched too tight. Her voice had barely carried above a whisper. "He's not dead." Sebastian said nothing at first. His shoulders didn't move. His face didn't change. But his breath slowed. He looked at her, really looked, and saw the woman who had built herself again from the bones of being forgotten. And now, here came the past, sharp and wide as a river thawing in spring. She didn't tremble, but her hands were pale against the worn paper. The letter says he lost his memory after the collapse, railroad cave-in up north. Woke up in a clinic in Montana 2 months ago. A nurse recognized my name from an old registry. Her lips tightened. He's been looking for me since. Sebastian nodded once, a gesture that barely touched the wind. Inside, Lark stirred. A soft thump of boots. Then silence. Evelina lowered her voice. "He wants me to come. Says he remembers now. Wants to see me again." Sebastian turned toward the horizon, where pines clawed at the snowy sky like cathedral spires. "You gonna go?" The question landed with a weight she wasn't ready for. But it was fair. Plain. No bitterness in his tone. No assumption. Just Sebastian, the way he'd always been, offering her the space to choose. She folded the letter. "I don't know." And she didn't. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat beside the fire long after Lark had curled against her shoulder, the child's breath warm against her arm. Her eyes wandered to the little carved figures on the sill. 3 of them, not 2. She thought about the silence Sebastian gave her, not to hurt, but to trust. In the morning, she rose before the fire was rekindled and walked out into the woods behind the cabin, where frost clung to pine needles like silver. She stood there beneath those tall trees, head tilted back. "I'm not a woman who likes to be chased," she whispered to the trees. "But I'm tired of always being left behind." Somewhere behind her, boots crunched the snow. She didn't turn. She knew the gate. "I didn't expect to be given back the past," she said. Sebastian's voice was quiet. "You think that's what this is?" She turned now, met his eyes. He stepped closer, not urgent, just present. "The man you buried ain't the man you'd find now. Not after 17 years of forgetting. Not after you changed who you are to keep living." Her lip trembled once before she mastered it. "What if I owe him something?" "You owe yourself more," Sebastian said. She took a breath that stung. "Do you want me to stay?" The words fell into the hush like stones into still water. His jaw worked once. Then he said, "It ain't about want. It's about what heals you." That hurt more than if he begged. She nodded once and walked past him, her fingers brushing his coat as she passed, soft as goodbye. Inside, she packed her bag. Lark watched from the quilt, brow furrowed. You leaving? She asked, her voice barely above air. Evelina knelt beside her. I have to find something I lost a long time ago. The girl looked down, twisting her fingers into the fringe of the blanket. Will you come back? Evelina didn't answer. She just kissed her forehead. Sebastian hitched the wagon without comment. The horses wafted steam into the air. The road glistened. She climbed up beside him, her hand brushing his briefly. Neither looked at the other. The town was quiet when they arrived. Sunday bells echoed from the chapel, and women in shawls crossed the square with glances tucked in their sleeves. Evelina stepped down. I can take the rest from here. Sebastian nodded, remained seated. His eyes lingered not on her, but on the road ahead. She turned once, halfway up the walk. If he truly remembered me, she said, why wait 2 months? He didn't answer. He didn't need to. She found Jacob in a rented room over the butcher's shop. The nurse who wrote the letter sat with him, watching her closely as she entered. The man at the table looked familiar, but worn strange. His hair thinner. His eyes darted rather than held. The scar above his brow that had once worried her now seemed like the least of his changes. Evelina, he said, voice eager, too loud. She sat slowly, watching his hands fidget with a silver spoon. I thought you were dead, he said. I remembered you singing. She nodded. That's a good memory. The nurse stepped out. Jacob leaned closer. We can start over. I'm better now. But she saw it. The want in his eyes wasn't for her. It was for something he lost. For the self he had been when she'd been beside him. You don't know who I am anymore, she said gently. I'll remember, he promised. Her hands curled in her lap. No, she said softly. I've lived a life while you forgot. That matters. He stilled. The silence cracked between them. She stood. I hope you heal, Jacob. I truly do. And she left. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, soft, steady, as if the sky was exhaling something it had held too long. She walked back to the wagon depot, found the next driver headed west, bought a ticket with hands that no longer trembled. She arrived at the cabin by nightfall. No lights burned in the windows. Her boots broke through a layer of ice as she crossed the porch. Inside, the fire was low, but lit. A plate covered in cloth waited on the table. Her quilt lay folded at the foot of the bed, and on the sill there were now 4 carved figures. Her breath caught. A 4th. A woman slightly taller now. A shape carved upright, not hunched or leaning, but standing, holding the hand of a smaller figure beside her. She turned toward the hearth, throat thick. Sebastian sat in the rocker, coat draped over one knee. His eyes met hers. Not questioning, not pleading, just open. She crossed the room slowly, stood in front of him. Her voice broke before it began. I thought I had to go find the woman I was. Sebastian looked up at her. Did you? No, she said. But I found the woman I became. He nodded once, then reached out softly like asking. She let him take her hand. And in that quiet cabin, where no music played, where no audience clapped, Evelina Rosewood, age 55, salt in her hair, pain in her past, stood taller than the pines. Because some women aren't rescued. They return. They choose. And the world changes for it.